I'm Michael Campbell, and today we want to look from an Adventist historical perspective about the topic of Christian nationalism. If you were like me on January 6th, I found myself very startled to see a number of so-called patriots storming the Capitol of the United States. As I listened to some of my fellow brothers and sisters in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, many of whom I consider to be my friends, I found myself kind of scratching my head a little bit at how some Adventists found themselves supportive of not only those endeavors, but other kinds of conspiracy theories related to QAnon and other related topics. And what concerned me particularly was the topic of politics and our faith. How should we as Adventists relate to the wider culture, especially when it comes to politics? To that end, recently, we were able to host, through a number of scholarly organizations spearheaded by the Adventist Society for Religious Studies, with the Adventist Theological Society, the Adventist Peace Fellowship, a number of other organizations, as well as the North American Division, a special online symposium where we had a number of experts from around the denomination who were able to engage in the topic of faith and politics. And I would encourage those of you who are listening that want to know more and that are curious after this presentation today to check out that presentation. It's on the North American Division webpage on their Facebook page, and you can easily locate that, the symposium from 2 weeks ago. Our keynote speakers were none other than Andrew Whitehead and Samuel L. Perry, who recently wrote this book that I have up here on the screen, Taking America Back for God, a look at Christian nationalism in the United States. It was published this last year by Oxford University Press, and these two sociologists have done some really interesting work looking at and trying to better define what is Christian nationalism. Well, they have a number of different definitions, but a working definition that they use and that I adopt for the purposes of the presentation this afternoon is that this idea of Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic religion. In other words, it's people who confuse their religious and their political identities and into one. Secondly, Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian in its identity, history, symbols, and public policies, and must keep it that way. We're going to look at some examples of that later on in our Adventist past. And then third, there are some identifying characteristics that are quite sort of like a pattern, you might say, that include nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. That's not to say that any one person has all of these characteristics, but these are kind of tendencies. These are, keep in mind, these are sociologists, so what they're doing is trying to be descriptive, not prescriptive. So they're trying to look at broad patterns. What are these kinds of indicators? In the next slide, they, in addition to that, there's a number of other books that have been published. One of the most interesting is by Jason Stanley, it's titled How Fascism Works, the Politics of Us versus Them. And I think this is important because a lot of what I'm seeing going on within our broader culture and society, and even within the church, is this sort of polarization that's going on. And so if a person identifies with one political candidate or another, or one political party or another, that you begin to see that polarization begins to take place, and there's no longer conversation. And so someone identifies and they say, oh, well, I voted for the other candidate, and they villainize the other person of voting for the other political candidate or party. And I want to be very clear in my talk this afternoon. This is not about politics or partisan politics. What we're talking about is the relationship of politics to faith and how we as Adventists, as Christians, should relate to the broader cultural and political milieu. So I just want to preface what I'm about to say and some of the rest of this research. Anyways, Jason Stanley, again, another researcher, scholar, is looking at some of these kinds of patterns, characteristics that, again, we see Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry describe in their sociological study. And so here's some of the strongest predictors. And again, just because a person may have voted for a particular candidate doesn't mean that they are necessarily a Christian nationalist. What I'm doing is trying to show some of the research, some of those indicators. And these are some of the strongest predictors of Christian nationalism that we've already been talking about. Number one is they voted in the 2016 election for Donald Trump. Secondly, opposing scientists and science education. Third, holding prejudiced views against racial minorities. Number four, holding traditionalist gender attitudes. And I think what they mean by that, in my understanding and review of their research, is what they're talking about is that, for example, women should only be at home. They shouldn't have jobs, or perhaps not even to be educated, these kinds of things. So and so the idea of women being engaged in the wider society. So traditionalist gender attitudes, believe in capital punishment and police cracking down on troublemakers. This is especially interesting in light of racial attitudes and some of the racial discussions going on in this country, and then holding anti-immigration views. So these are, again, these are descriptors looking at this sort of Christian nationalism, this kind of hierarchical approach, the strongman approach, so to speak, to politics, and trying to understand these general patterns. I want to show actually some of the research from Whitehead and Perry. This is very curious, and I find this most interesting. As they were looking and doing these surveys, these sociological patterns, they began to see some trends here with Christian nationalism. First of all, you have the percentage or the probability of agreement, and you can see that it increases much and much higher, and you have the scale of Christian nationalism, which increases over time, versus those who exhibit religious practice. And you may be wondering, what are we talking about with religious practice? Well, what we really mean and what they identify are going to church regularly, reading the Bible, praying, and that people who tend to do this, again, these are in broad patterns, broad trends, that you actually see a decline in Christian nationalism, and I find that most interesting. Well, now that we have discussed a little bit about some of the current challenges of Christian nationalism, particularly in the United States at this moment, I want to spend some time and look in our Adventist past about how our early Adventist pioneers dealt with Christian nationalism, or maybe we would say patriotism. What is the relationship between the church and the government? Should Adventists vote? And what happens when there's a particular party or a law or some kind of legislation that goes against our moral beliefs, against Scripture? And so I want to look at some case studies from our Adventist past. The first one I want to look at is the Fugitive Slave Law, all the way back in 1850. What a lot of Adventists don't know, but has become very clear in the past few years through ongoing research, is just how extensive our early Adventist pioneers were in their stand, their very strong stand against slavery. Whether it's William Miller, George Storrs, Joshua Himes during the Millerite heyday, to after the disappointment, where you begin to see that Adventists continued that strong stance against slavery. And so it's intriguing that by 1850, when the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law, that Adventists are beginning to wonder, what will they do? Because these, as slaves would flee from the south on the Underground Railroad, the so-called Underground Railroad, they would travel north. But what this law enabled are these slave catchers to go into the north, and they would be forced effectively to, and even fined for harboring these runaway slaves. Well, how should Adventists respond to that? Should they obey the government? Like Paul says in Romans about being good citizens, or should they disobey? And I find it very interesting that our early Adventist pioneers were nothing short than emphatic in saying that, yes, we should disobey, we should disregard this law. In fact, Ellen White was one of the most outspoken individuals saying, no, do not return those slaves. And so we have evidence of people like John Byington, strong evidence that indicates that he and others, of course, they weren't going around and advertising this fact at the time, so it makes it a little bit hard to document historically, but they made their views about abolition against slavery known, and there is strong circumstantial evidence that supports the idea that places like Battle Creek, our church headquarters, were strong points where slaves that were fleeing knew they were safe places, safe havens for them to escape to. The next slide that I want to show you is an actual picture. It's been digitized. This is courtesy of Kevin Burton, who's been doing some of his own research on the relationship of politics and the Adventism. It's an early image of the beast of Revelation 13. You may recall that the beast is described as this lamb-like beast, but then begins to speak with the voice of a dragon and becomes increasingly oppressive. And here is one of the earlier artistic descriptions, or depictions, I should say, of this beastly power in Revelation 13. And what I find most interesting about this, you see the lightning coming down from heaven, but underneath to the bottom of that beast, right under the paw of the beast, are these twin evils of slavery and creeds. Now, early Adventists found this very important because as they were looking at this developing beast and oppression that as Adventists we look to in the end of times, that in our eschatologies we get closer to the end, that we believe that this will happen and eventually lead to Sunday laws and increasing oppression and God's people who will stand firmly for the truth at the very end. They saw, these early Adventist pioneers saw these tendencies, including slavery, as indicators, this racial oppression as an indicator of the lamb-like beast. Well, let's look at some more case studies. A few years later, in 1856, we have Uriah Smith, and we begin to see, as Adventists are wrestling, should Adventists actually vote? Now, if there's legislation that's directly in contradiction to our faith and our biblical values, our moral values, then we should disobey. But what about voting? What about elections? Should we go down to the ballot box? Well, Adventists were wondering these questions, and so, in Ellen White, in fact, she wrote emphatically, "My brethren, shall we spend our time in political campaigns when we so soon expect Christ in all the glory of his Father and all the holy angels with him, when he shall sit upon the throne of his glory?" In other words, Ellen White's saying, you know, if Adventists are really convicted about Christ's soon return, will we have time to waste in political campaigns and these sorts of things? And Uriah Smith, he is asking the same kinds of questions. He says, to the question why we do not with our votes and influence labor against the evil tendency of the times, we reply that our views of prophecy lead us to the conclusion that things will not be bettered. And we feel it is our duty to confine our efforts to preparing ourselves and others as far as it lies in us for the great and final issues pressing around us. In other words, hey, let's keep our eyes fixed on our Adventist message. This is what's really important. Let's not get distracted by partisan politics. In fact, in the next slide, R.F. Cottrell, one of the early Adventist ministers, he writes this. He says, under these circumstances, again, dealing with the same election, if I cast my vote at all, it will tell for or against the making of the image. I shall aid in creating an abomination which will persecute the saints of God. But on the other hand, if I vote against this work, I shall vote against the fulfillment of prophecy. Therefore, I cannot vote at all. In other words, what Cottrell is trying to say is, what do you do when there's no good option when you go down to the ballot box? And he is suggesting that sometimes, if you and your moral convictions cannot see a good outcome, there is good, strong moral ground to simply not vote, to abstain from the political process. And I noted recently some good friends of mine that said, I can't in good conscience vote for either candidate. I admire that kind of conviction that a person says, I'm voting out of my beliefs informing my faith, not my politics instead. And so Cottrell says, there's times when we just can't vote. And that was what the decision he came to. In 1859, I want to look at this next slide. There's actually a local election in Battle Creek. Our church leaders, and again, this is before 1863 when even our general conference is organized. So this is a kind of important development as Adventists are trying to understand their own identity, how they'll relate to the wider state. And Ellen White, in her diary, she actually talks about this. She talks about this intense discussion that our early pioneers are having as they're wrestling with this matter of voting and the local election. She talks about how they were talking about it, her husband, James White, J.N. Andrews, and she says they think it right to vote in favor of temperance men being in office in our city instead of, by their silence, running the risk of having intemperance men put in office. And then she finally, after discussing a little bit more, says, "Oh, that they may all act in the fear of God." So there's an ongoing development, ongoing discussion here. She says also, again, men of intemperance have been in the office today in a flattering manner, expressing their approbation of the course of the Sabbath keepers and not voting, and expressed hopes that they will stick to their course and, like the Quakers, not cast their vote. Satan and his evil angels are busy at this time, and he has workers upon the earth. May Satan be disappointed, is my prayer. In other words, as the early Adventist pioneers are wrestling with what they should do, they come to the conviction that at times it may be necessary, it may even be prudent that they go down to the ballot box if they know that there is a good candidate and it will make a difference. And so, and not to let their voice and their sense of agency to be obfuscated. Again, next year, 1860, I want you to see this. This is a picture of Abraham Lincoln, the young Abraham Lincoln, as he's getting ready to run for office. And I quote, "The political excitement of 1860 will probably run as high as it has for many years, and we would warn our brethren not to be drawn into it. We are not prepared to prove from the Bible that it would be wrong for a believer in the third angel's message to do in a manner becoming his profession and cast his vote. We do not recommend this, neither do we oppose. If a brother chooses to vote, we cannot condemn him, and we want the same liberty if we do not." The person writing here is none other than James White. And James White is trying to argue that there are times when it is a good idea to vote, but it is a matter of personal conscience. It's a matter of personal, each person should decide for themselves, and they should not be impinged upon or pressure to vote a certain way. But it's interesting that as this election unfolds, he goes on to add, he says that we do believe that he who enters into the spirit of the coming contest loses the spirit of the present truth and endangers his own soul. In other words, James White's warning, if you become too political, it's possible that your politics will eclipse your faith. Finally, it's not till the end of the American Civil War, 4 years later, 5 years after the 1860 election, that the church finally votes for the very first time a position on how the church should relate to politics. And it's actually in 1865, if you look in this voted action by the General Conference, it says, "Resolved, that in our judgment, the act of voting, when exercised in behalf of justice, humanity, and right, is in itself blameless, and may be at some times highly proper. But that the casting of any vote that shall strengthen the cause of such crimes as intemperance, insurrection, and slavery, we regard as highly criminal in the sight of heaven. But we would deprecate any participation in the spirit of party strife." Well, what's going on here? Well, remember, this is a developmental time in early Adventist history as Adventists are beginning to not only wrestle with their identity and their core beliefs and as the church is organized, but also how early Adventists would relate to the wider culture, especially when it came to politics. And as the church grew, as they developed a sense of agency, they realized that there were times not only when they needed to disobey certain laws and go down to the ballot box, but that when someone actually voted, they had a moral responsibility to look at the general direction of who they are and what they are supporting. And of course, Adventists are very consistent, Ellen White most emphatically, that Adventists should not be distracted by partisan politics. They shouldn't be subsumed by all of the political stuff, because our priority is heaven. Our priority is to share our faith and to lead others to Jesus Christ, and not to let those political strife and rankling go on in our midst. But that at the same time, that didn't mean that Adventists were uninformed. It didn't mean that Adventists didn't care about politics. In fact, because of those same biblical values, that there were some things that were clearly antithetical. And so in the light of the Civil War, the insurrection, the Confederacy, and slavery, and intemperance, that Adventists, because they cared so deeply about their faith informed their politics, not their politics informing their faith. And so there was moral grounds. There was a moral duty to have convictions about what were the issues going on within the world around them. Joseph Clark, who was a layperson, he would later go as he was a school teacher, would go down to the South as a missionary, and we've actually now found a picture of him that is in the Center for Adventist Research. "Shall we meddle with politics?" Clark asks. "No. If we must mingle in the noisy crowd and shout the praises of the poor, puny men who's to be raised to the pinnacle of power, no. If we give currency to the many-voiced slanderous reports which fill the political atmosphere with clouds and mists, but we may deposit a ballot quietly in the box in behalf of freedom and as quietly give a reason therefor." In other words, all you need to do is go and vote. Adventists had a fundamental conviction voting was a good way to exert your ability to influence, to exert your agency. James White, he adds this after the Civil War. Check out this other slide. "We as a people, as Adventists, have before us an all-absorbing subject and a work of the greatest importance from which our minds should not be diverted. It would be our duty to adapt ourselves as far as possible without compromising truth to all who come within the reach of our influence, and at the same time stand free from the strife and corruption of the parties that are striving for the mastery." And I want you to see this as well. I know we're going through a lot of material very quickly, but Ellen White, she's very balanced and understands this balance between avoiding partisan politics, but letting also our faith inform our political outlook and the positions that we take. She says this: "We are not, as a people, to become mixed up with the political questions. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers in political strife, nor bind with them in their attachments. Keep your voting to yourself. Do not feel it your duty to urge everyone to do as you do." I'm reminded, as when I was a pastor, how I'd have some church members from different political parties, And I tried my best as a pastor to be as neutral as I possibly could. And then one particular week in an election year, I'd have people from one party, and they were putting all kinds of literature through the church and the church mailboxes. And then the following week, there'd be a counterstrike. And I was constantly having to pull all this stuff out, because what was happening is people were going back and forth, all of this, and they were allowing that to actually separate them and cause divisions amongst themselves. And that was some time ago. That's not even in light of the more recent American politics that have been very divisive. And so Ellen White's emphatic: let's not let politics divide us, where we so focused on our particular views that we end up creating divisions amongst ourselves. She goes on to say, the Lord would have us bury political questions. We cannot with safety vote for political parties or let political questions alone. It is a mistake, she says, for you to link your interests with any political party to cast your vote with them or for them. In other words, Ellen White's saying, be careful, be very careful. And I keep coming back to this resounding theme that our faith should inform our politics, not our politics informing our faith. That's how I see Ellen White, very absolutely crystal clear on this matter. In fact, Paul Gordon, one of the former directors of the Ellen G. White Estate, after looking all of her counsels on politics and voting, he summarizes it into 3 significant points. He says, number 1, Ellen White was always for standing on the side of temperance and virtue. In other words, we should stand on our moral ground when we have moral convictions that matter. Number 2, voting is a personal decision. We shouldn't feel that we need to force other people to vote exactly the same way that we do. And number 3, we should stand free from political strife and corruption. We shouldn't be voting just because we self-identify with a political party or a candidate. We need to make sure that with every election that we are allowing our moral compass and Scripture to guide us in the voting when it comes to the ballot box. Well, there's a couple more case studies I want to get into, and just to kind of illustrate this a bit more and transition into the 20th century, because while these were the ideals that Ellen White and our pioneers strove for, it doesn't mean that we always reach those ideals, and at times we've been a bit challenged. 1881, the Iowa Camp Meeting, this issue of the ballot box. If you look on the slide here, going down to the ballot box is brought up again. Now, in the late 1870s, early 1880s, a major issue was the issue of drinking, of temperance, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union becomes a major force within American society. In fact, a lot of Adventists don't know that Ellen White actually spoke a number of occasions for the WCTU, as it was known, trying to urge people to better understand the dangers of alcohol and the importance of temperance. In fact, Ellen White was probably best known of all of her to the wider public as a well-known temperance speaker, going to these large temperance gatherings. And some people even asked, is it right to go down as this issue of temperance is coming up as a major issue? Is it okay to go down to the ballot box? And Ellen White says, yes, you should. In fact, she even talks about on some other occasions that whether it's right for young people to run for office or be trained for government positions. And she says that there may be some young people, just like Daniel, that God has called for such a time as this. On the next slide, we see some more of Ellen White's quotations. For the sake of time, I'll be brief and just highlight. People, again, are asking, is it okay? And this is at the very end of her life. Maybe some people wonder, did Ellen White change her position at the very end of her life about voting and these kinds of things? And this is in the eve of World War I there. And she says, while we are in no wise to become involved in political questions, yet it is our privilege to take our stand decidedly on all questions related to temperance reform. So again, you see Ellen White. She's letting her biblical values, her passion for temperance that's informed by Scripture, to inform her political outlook and saying, hey, this is important. Well, should Adventists vote on the temperance ticket? That's what they're basically asking. And she says this, and this is in the Review and Herald of 1914, should not that influence and that vote be cast on the side of temperance and virtue? I like this. Ellen White, very sensible, very practical in terms of how she related to the wider world of politics and our faith. The next slide I have here is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I wanted you to just see this so you can kind of see the social activism that's happening in the latter part of the 19th century, the early 20th century. And again, Ellen White, very passionate, urging Adventists to get involved, to stand up, to let their voices be heard, even, as I mentioned, going and speaking as a well-known temperance speaker. The next slide, I have a few more references by Ellen White. Again, I can just only highlight a few different things, but the situation got a little bit closer to home because in Battle Creek, there was an Adventist church leader who decided that he would run for mayor of Battle Creek. And Ellen White, she is quite emphatic. She's bold in saying that Adventists should speak up about this topic. Intemperate men should not, by vote of the people, be placed in positions of trust. So this is hardly a passive, just stay at home and don't do anything. She's saying Adventists need to be involved. They need to actually go and vote. Arthur White, in his biography, references this next one. Shall we vote for prohibition? She was asked. Yes, to a man everywhere. And perhaps I shall shock some of you if I say, if necessary, vote on the Sabbath day for prohibition if you cannot at any other time. In other words, this is surprised me when I first read it. In fact, on one occasion when she, I believe, was down here in Texas visiting, she actually got a wagon load of church members and went down to the ballot box to help those church members to be able to vote on the temperance ticket to vote some people out of office that were for alcohol consumption. And one of her very last statements, she warned that every voter has some voice in determining what laws shall control the nation. And she asked, should not that influence and that vote be cast on the side of temperance and virtue? This hardly sounds like someone who says that we shouldn't be involved in politics, but rather we need to avoid partisan strife and let our faith inform our politics, as I keep coming back to. 1896, there was another great political striving and an election going on. And Doug Morgan, who's an Adventist historian, in the Ellen White Encyclopedia, he talks about this relationship of politics and faith, and he notes that there's this balance, this fine line, that Ellen White did not give a blanket endorsement for politics. I'm quoting him, if the political realm presented opportunity, even obligation for Christian service, it also presented dangerous influences that threatened to mold those involved rather than vice versa. He goes on, Ellen White was clear that impressed on believers the principle, he writes, that citizenship in Christ's kingdom must animate and control their interaction with the political powers of earth. And with this populist surge in 1896, she realized that even though they were pushing for the silver currency, that this was not going to fix the economic injustice among the nation's rural and working classes. Now, it's important to know Ellen White was supportive of doing everything possible to help those who were destitute and poor, but she warned that this particular political scheme would have the very opposite effect. She writes, the direction from the voice of the Son of God, she declared, is you will not give your voice or influence to any policy to enrich a few, to bring oppression and suffering to the poorer classes of humanity. In other words, Ellen White saw right through this, that this was not really something that was aimed at helping people. This was a political ploy that would cause trouble. If we go to the next slide, we look in 1897, reflecting back on the same 1896 election, she says, there is fraud on both sides, and urged and said that those for whom the Lord Jesus is the captain to file under his banner and avoid linking up with either party. So you see Ellen White, as she is saying, hey, go down to the ballot box and vote, but yet on the other side, she's not just saying, go down and vote for every election or every candidate, and that often there is quite a bit of political rancor and strife. You go on, I now want to kind of transition just a little bit to shift into the 20th century, because we've looked at how our early Adventist pioneers have dealt with this, but in the 20th century, we begin to see the sort of a general trend or ascendancy of Christian nationalism, coming back to the beginning of this talk, which raises the question in more recent decades, where we begin to see, have we actually, and have to ask ourselves the question, have we really, have we perhaps at times began to lose some of that focus of the early Adventist pioneers, and allowed perhaps some of our well-meaning patriotism to go beyond just mere patriotism? And again, I don't think our pioneers, and I personally don't have any problem with being proud to be a citizen of a particular country. But here what we're talking about is something where it's something more than that. And that's where it moves and transitions or shifts from merely political identification or identification as a patriot, being patriotic, to something more, into what is deeper, into Christian nationalism, where your politics become all transforming or all consuming and becomes much deeper than that. And the real turning point is World War I. And I want to go immediately to the slide after that, which is showing some of these soldiers who were fighting, because as World War I is going on, there begin to emerge a number of questions. Are Adventists loyal citizens of this country? And this becomes especially problematic because our church, about this time, through the early 1920s, begins to actually have more church members outside of North America than you have inside North America. So it's truly becoming a global church. And so with the advent of a world global conflict, you have suddenly Adventists who are not only fighting in the war on the American front, but you have Adventists, faithful Adventists, who are on the other side as well. And we know that when World War I happened, that 10% of the world church membership, the worldwide Seventh-day Adventist Church, was based in Germany. So you begin to have some suspicions. Are Adventists somehow secret sympathizers to Germany? And people began to ask these kinds of questions. Several historians in the last few years have begun to actually done some research where the government began to keep tabs on certain church leaders and start censoring Adventist literature, wondering, if this all of this talk about the lamb-like beast, if that's America will speak like a dragon, can Adventists truly be considered as loyal, patriotic citizens? And this begins to raise larger questions of the relationship of the church and government here. In the next slide, I have a photograph of this. And one of the things that's very interesting is that most Adventist churches, like the wider general culture in America, began to, during World War I, began to actually put flags on their platform. In fact, I've noticed that most Seventh-day Adventist churches today, I often see here in America, have an American flag right up in the front. In fact, here in the Keene Church, I had a religion scholar, David Bebington, who came for a lectureship, and I asked him, as he is a guest in our church service, and we had him speak in the afternoon for one of our lectureships at Southwestern Adventist University, and asked him, what surprised you the most about coming to a Seventh-day Adventist church for the first time? And he said to me, I was surprised to see a flag up in the front of church. Well, Keene here, and this is not, I'm not on any kind of campaign to get rid of flags in churches per se, but we should understand and recognize that Adventists were under a lot of pressure during World War I. Are you patriotic? Do you support your government? And one way they were able to do that is to start putting flags in churches. And today we have the result of that, even though we as Adventists also very much support the separation of church and state. And so Dr. Bebbington, as I understood him, saw that as a contradiction. I have in the next picture here, I want to show this to you. I found this in the Signs of the Times. This was the cover. You begin to actually see an American war effort, a whole column in the weekly church publications where they're trying to show that Adventists are patriotic, that Adventists need to do their part for the war effort. But I found this one particularly interesting because we're trying to define Christian nationalism as this fusion where people are unable to tell the difference between their faith and their political identity. And this is a good example of this, I think. And you have this article by Lewis Christian, an Adventist church leader from this time period. And in this picture, you have some immigrants. And on the left-hand side, you see a well-dressed man in a suit. And in the middle is his mother and his brother on the other side of him, who are kind of in shanty clothes, disheveled. And below that is a caption that shows, here is what Americanization does. Takes people that are refugees, that are poor, and makes them into something. And so here we see not only within the wider culture, but within Adventism, especially in the early 20th century with World War I, and I will argue shortly in a few minutes, World War II, Adventists begin to fuse, not all Adventists, but some Adventists have trouble fusing that their religious and political identities together. Another good example of this is in my next slide. This is a picture from one of our church publications. I'm actually working on some ongoing research on Adventists in the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s. Again, in the wake of World War I, a lot of anti-immigration, this sort of, and the Ku Klux Klan was very much for private Christian education. They were against Catholicism, and a number of Adventists begin to strongly support the KKK as it becomes known. This is an actual cross burning. We know that a number of churches and school campuses across North America, there were Adventists who were active leaders in the Klan and would hold regular cross burnings. Again, you see Adventists having trouble. This ideal that's described by our pioneers, by Ellen White, you're seeing that they are fusing their faith and their politics, and we would clearly see this today as Christian nationalism, where they're both with the rise of the Klan and with Adventist involvement in the Klan. Again, not all Adventists were part of the Klan at this time, but it's significant to note that there were a number of people who were, and actually there are references to this in church publications. Another example, just to try to illustrate this, World War II. We have some good examples, some amazing examples of Adventists who stood faithfully in protecting the Jews. There are a number of people, if you go to Israel, there is a beautiful museum with the crosses and everything else, and a number of Adventists who are distinguished recipients during World War II for saving the lives of Jews. And we know the horrors of World War II, where some 6 million individuals, 6 million Jews perished in what we now today call as the Holocaust. And while that's part of the story, that's not all of the story, because as already mentioned, we had a significant Seventh-day Adventist presence in Germany and a strong proclivity by some Adventists, including quite a number of Adventist church leaders, toward the rising strong man in Germany in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler. And there is a paper that was done by a friend of mine, Harold Alamia. You can find it online, published in the Journal of Mission Studies. I have it referenced at the very end in my citations here, and I'm quoting from him in this next slide here, where he actually studies Adventist involvement in Germany and Adventist support of Hitler. And there was very strong support overall by Adventists in the majority who saw Hitler as the right direction. Of course, they weren't blind. They saw what was happening. They knew what was happening at the rise of the Nazi regime, but they didn't want to get on the wrong side of it. And so it was much easier to be complicit and to simply support it. And even a few who actively worked diligently to try to garner the attention of Hitler. By the way, if you want a really great breakdown in Adventist involvement with the Nazis, my good friend Matthew Lucio, who hosts the Adventist History Podcast, is part of a Adventist History Podcast network that Greg Howell and I are right now doing. We're doing the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast, interviewing historians about Adventist history. So just had to give a shout out to Matthew Lucio and the Adventist History Podcast, because he's got a 3-part series in season 2 about Adventists and the Nazis. And if you want to get into a lot more detail about how Adventists related to this, I would strongly encourage you, check out that podcast, that 3-part episode series. I believe it's 22, 23, and 24. Great information, great research that he's done on Adventists and especially in Germany and their support of Adolf Hitler. So I'm just highlighting a few things to help illustrate the point of where we've had difficulties in our Adventist past with fusing, again, our faith and our politics. Adolf Minnick, the president of the Adventist Church in Germany, penned his satisfaction with the election of Adolf Hitler in the August edition of the Adventblatt, the Adventist periodical of Germany. He says, a fresh, enlivening, and renewing Reformation spirit is blowing through our German lands. This is a time of decision, a time of such support for believing youth as has not been for a long time. The Word of God and Christianity shall be restored to a place of honor. In other words, he's imploring Adventists to support Hitler. He's going to restore the honor of Germany and the honor of Adventism. Another example we see is another church leader, Wilhelm Mueller, who went so far as to label Hitler as a chosen by God for the office of chancellor, and praising him in the similar way because of his stances on Adventist health reform, noting that Hitler was an anti-alcoholic and a non-smoker, and he was even a vegetarian. In other words, there was a lot to love about Hitler. He shared a lot of Adventist core values. Well, I want to be sure to highlight and note in this presentation, just because there was a strong fusion in some parts of Adventism in the 20th century, and this tendency, this proclivity and towards Christian nationalism, some people fought against that. And one of my most beloved stories of that is none other than Desmond Doss. His picture's up here where he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. And his story is well known, how in Iwo Jima as a medic, he refused to bear arms. They made fun of him, these kinds of things. In fact, there's a recent movie that's been made about this and a number of documentaries which are very admirable, focusing on his life and his convictions, where he refused to even bear arms, calling himself a conscientious cooperator. He wouldn't take life, but he would work to save lives. And of course, during World War II in the Pacific Theater, he would even go not only to save fellow American troops, but brought aid to Japanese soldiers who were wounded as well. It takes a big person to be able to have a influential faith that allowed him to stand up for his religious convictions and to try to bring peace and healing in the midst of the storm. Of course, with every story of Desmond Doss, there are other stories of people who didn't fare so well. And a shout out to my friend Bill Cork, who has been doing quite a bit of research related to how in the wake of World War II, and every time there's a major political conflict, that there is this question of patriotism. How will people relate to the wider culture and faith? And unfortunately at times, and in this next slide with Carlisle B. Haynes, I want you to see this because he takes this idea of pacifism, but he is now focused so much on Christian nationalism, I guess you would say, that he infuses within this a sort of racism. In fact, he begins to write, Carlisle B. Haynes, a prominent Adventist evangelist in the wake of World War II, of a segregated heaven, of a black and white heaven, because this sort of Christian nationalism within the wider American culture and by some Adventists began to take on racial overtones, which is what I want to point out. Some of our challenges with race in our Adventist past have been extremely problematic. And much of this has theological overtones as well. I don't have time to go into this today, but in the early 20th century with the rise of fundamentalism, you begin to see people that as they, in the wider fundamentalist movement, who are attracted, for example, I've already illustrated the Ku Klux Klan, these kinds of things that, but they had very much racial overtones to them. And so you begin to see, as Adventists imbibe this wider culture and Christian nationalism, some of those earlier stances that were so progressive, such as abolitionism and against intemperance, the temperance movement, I should say, some of this progressive stance within Adventism begin to erode or fade away. Of course, in concluding here today, I want to show one last slide because I've tried to illustrate a little bit today that both the ideal of our early Adventist pioneers, that our faith should inform our politics, not our politics informing our faith, but at times we have fallen short of those ideals where politics have informed our faith all too much. And we see that with the Ku Klux Klan. We see that with Hitler and the rise of Nazi Germany. We see that finally one last example is in the 1990s, and specifically 1993 with the Rwandan genocide, where you actually had Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and pastors leading the way from one tribe to kill people who were members of the other tribe. Now, of course, this isn't Christian nationalism, but this is very much the same challenge of allowing people to, with tribalism, to allow those things to dictate one's faith. And of course, afterwards, today, we know that one of the very first ministers was Eli Safan, and I can't say his name, I'm sure, but Kurutamana, who was actually convicted of war crimes of genocide by the International Court. And you can find those details easily online. So what would make it so that an Adventist actually felt so strongly that they had lost their moral compass, their moral bearings, their Adventist identity, that they would allow these things to shape their faith rather than the other way around? Well, that's always the danger, I believe, that if we're not careful and we are not aware of what's going around us in the midst of so much partisanism and partisan politics within the culture around us, that at any age and any given time, if we're not careful, that we need to go back to the spirit of the early Adventist pioneers as they wrestled through these kinds of things. It's not wrong to have political views, and it's not wrong to go out and vote. But the idea is that when we do so, we should not blindly do so, but that we need to allow and find, and in my conclusions here, I want to highlight this, that to find the balance between politics and faith, that it's okay to go ahead and exert one's agency through the ballot box, especially, as Ellen White implores, when that ballot box, that decision has moral implications. Again, slavery and intemperance. Ellen White also was very clear and consistently arguing against partisan politics, following it blindly, either voting for a party or a candidate. We need to be careful as Seventh-day Adventists in how we make the decisions that we do when we go down to the ballot box, that we're not just doing it because I self-ascribe to a particular candidate or party, that we're not just being partisan about how we go about doing so. And Adventists should, in fact, vote and exercise, encourage one another in a respectful and kind way. There can be people, even in the recent election, I've talked to friends who have voted differently than I have chosen to vote. And I'm not here to tell you that either, because that's not the purpose of today. But I respect those who vote differently than I do, especially when they're able to say, oh, I voted based on this premise or this kind of thing that informed my decision to vote. And that's okay for there to be different viewpoints. But we shouldn't put one another down when we vote differently than we do. And as I point out in this presentation, in the 20th century, Adventists have struggled to find this balance. We have not always had a perfect record here. There are stories that are admirable, like Desmond Doss and those who saved the lives of Jews during the Holocaust, but tragically, there were many more who did not, who were complicit, who did allow their politics to blindly overshadow their faith and lose sight of Jesus and the Adventist message that we believe. And when we look in our Adventist past and see those shortcomings, it's not for the purpose to highlight those embarrassing moments, but it should serve as a wake-up call for each of us to make sure that we allow our faith to shape our politics and not our politics to shape our faith.